welcome everyone to the London Buddhist Centre. Really good to see so many of you here. Somebody was just saying it's a very popular subject. I should have done Buddhism and housing, or Buddhism and underfloor central heating. That would have kept you away. Anyway, so we're going to do sex. In fact, on the programme it said Maitreyabandhu : sex, which looked a bit worrying. I'm going to talk about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I'll leave about 10 minutes to answer questions, and then I'm going to do another talk downstairs. Luckily, there's not a costume change needed. Okay, so yes, I'll talk for about half an hour probably, and then leave a bit of time for questions. So the first thing I was going to say is that I'm actually frankly a bit bored of talking about sex. I don't know whether anyone ever saw that the last Monty Python film, I think, where John Cleese pretends to have sex with a woman in front of his class of school boys, and they're all kind of looking at their watch and looking out the window and can't concentrate because it's so boring. So I feel slightly like him. So I wanted to sort of, say a few things about sex first. Slightly odd in a way. But I really want to try and take it a bit deeper and try and get a deeper sense of what sex might be a metaphor for, what it might be showing us about our needs, about our life. I thought that would be the more interesting thing to do. Yeah? So I'll try and find a way of exploring that. It's quite possible that as a culture, generally speaking, in the modern West, whatever that is, the modern world, the modern developed world, we've probably never been so preoccupied by sex. It's everywhere in the media, everything's being sold on sex. I've been particularly aware of this, the whole issue of pornography. I was looking at a talk about pornography, and most boys start watching pornography now when they're 10. Incredible, and there's more and more studies to show that it's highly addictive and highly destructive. It's massive, isn't it? The pornography industry is bigger than Hollywood. So sex is very much on our mind, collectively. There must be a reason for that. It must be trying to sort of tell us something. There must be something we can learn from that. So I wanted to try and explore that, if I can today. But first of all, just to sort of clear the ground, just sort of say something about Buddhism and sex. So the first thing to say is there's nothing wrong with it, folks. As long as it's fully consensual, etc., etc., there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing bad about it. There's nothing especially good about it. It's not a career choice, sort of thing. It's not something you can base your life around, or if you do, you'll cause yourself pain. If you try to base your life around things like sex gets addictive. You get the law of diminishing returns. You get less and less for your effort, as it were. And of course, sex is very time bound. One's attractiveness diminishes with time. For those of you who haven't experienced that yet, trust me, it will happen as soon as you think. So it's important, I think, to talk about sex because my experience of sex generally is that either it gets overvalued, obsessed about, pornography, etc., becoming a sort of symbol for that, or it gets vilified and moralized about. Neither of which I think really are very helpful. I think it's a subject we need to be thinking about, like many others subjects we need to be thinking about. Yes, and yeah, of course, then the other question around sex is sexuality. So it's not even that Buddhism would say that a particular kind of sexuality is good. So there's nothing wrong with being gay or a lesbian. There's no issue in that. Society has made that into an issue, particularly the church. But there isn't an issue. There isn't anything to be tolerant about because there's nothing to tolerate. It's like tolerating people with freckles or something like that. It's been a fuss over nothing. And again, sort of sexuality can become a career choice. Like if you're gay, you now have to sign up to a whole lifestyle package. So you can make too much of it, and again, you can vilify it. But actually, it's just like having curly hair or something like that. It really is no more or less than that. And the fuss that's been made about it, causing really incredible harm, is one of the unspoken things of history, really. I've been feeling more and more that the church should apologise to gay men and lesbians for the harm that they've caused, the completely unnecessary harm that they've caused. So if you're gay or straight, that's fine, whatever you are, as it were. And then we don't need to sort of assume necessarily that monogamy is a sort of moral position, as it were. You have to be very careful with the word position. In fact, you have to be careful with almost any word on this subject. Because you suddenly turn them into a double entendre. The assumption can be that the sort of moral way of sex is to have a monogamous relationship. I'd rather say, or I think that Buddhism would say, it's a choice you make. You can choose to do that, and that's a fair enough choice. It's not a more moral choice necessarily. It has good consequences. It creates for stability often. It's much, much better probably for children if you can have children, that you have a very stable. Children need a stable and loving environment beyond anything else. But I don't think there's anything particularly morally good about monogamy. For instance, it easily creates a lot of, all those sort of negative things about couples all can come into that. So you can have more than one sexual partner if you can do that. It's an organisational nightmare, but so long as everyone knows, as it were, what they signed up to, I think that's fine. It's just a question of getting all the text to the right people. So there's no in principle reason why you can't have more than one partner. You could discuss this with your current partner on the way out. You think, well, there's no reason in principle. See how it goes. It's usually quite a good starter for a conversation. So you could have more than one partner, and so on. None of that, I think, is really problematic. Of course, sex becomes problematic when we try and sort of get too much from it, when we try and get something from it that it can't really give us. That's when it really gets problematic and then gets addictive. We try and get it to meet needs that it can't possibly meet. And probably that's what's happening with sex more and more. Sex and love generally is that we're trying to get those very natural human things to meet almost metaphysical needs, existential needs. And they just can't do that. They're not supposed to do that. Sex wasn't supposed to be the answer of life. It isn't supposed to be the solution to life. And if we try to make it the solution to life, actually all we'll do is we'll cause ourselves pain, and very often cause other people pain. Because sex very often involves other people, not necessarily, but I don't need to talk you through all the details, but very often involves other people. So it's when we try and make of sex more than it can really give us. In a way, that's the same for anything, isn't it? If you're hungry and you eat, eating satisfies you. If you're bored and you eat because you're bored, or if you're lonely and you eat because you're lonely, then, of course, it won't satisfy you. You can eat a whole packet of hobnobs, and it won't fill the hole you're trying to fill, if you see what I mean. And that's becoming more and more of an issue, I think, generally in modern life, that we're trying to get human life to meet something that it can't really meet, to meet needs that we have, innate needs that we have, that they can't really meet. So if you're lonely, hobnobs will not meet that issue, nor will sex. If you're looking for transcending meaning in life, holidays won't meet that issue, nor will sex. In a way, it's the same sort of thing. If you want a hobnob because you want a little sugary moment with your tea, then yeah, it can do that. Even that moment you have to be a bit careful, don't you? Because one sugary moment easily leads to the next, doesn't it? Before you know it, you're halfway down the packet. So one of I think the issues about pleasure we need to think about is that pleasure is addictive. As soon as you have pleasure, you want to repeat it. In fact, the way you know it's pleasurable is that you want to repeat it, don't you? I say you, I mean me. So as soon as you have a pleasure, I want to repeat it. As soon as I have something that's painful, I want it to stop. That's inbuilt, isn't it? Innate. As soon as it's something that's comfortable, you want it to stop. As soon as something's pleasurable, you want to repeat it. The more you want to repeat it, the less pleasure you get. So when you've got to the third hobnob, do we still have hobnobs? When you get to the third hobnob, it's just calories. There's very little pleasure in it. They've even done studies to show this. When you first eat some chocolate, you get that hit of pleasure, and that's because your nervous system hasn't been expecting it, and then your nervous system wakes up and gets a strong hit of pleasure. The second square of chocolate, your nervous system has already got used to it, so it's half as pleasurable as the first, and the third square of chocolate is not pleasurable at all. It's just addictive by then. So this is part of the problem of pleasure, is that pleasure is addictive. The more you have, the more you want. The more you want, the less pleasure you have. The more you try and squeeze pleasure out of your life, the more you end up with pain. This is one of I think, the tragedies of life. We can't help but want more and more pleasure from life. But if we try and make that happen, if we try and squeeze pleasure out of life, what we end up with is with pain. I think of that sometimes even about the weekend. I will get to my subject in a minute. I'm thinking about the weekend. Here we are on a Sunday. You know that weekend sort of scenario, I don't know whether you have this, where you've had a hard week of work, and you just try and sort of cram your weekend full of pleasure. You've just got this pleasure weekend around, sex, hopefully, Sunday papers, a croissant, a groovy cafe, blues talk, and then the more you try and do that with your weekend, that horrible at the end, and then you feel you feel Monday morning galloping towards you from about lunchtime on Sunday. You hear the hooves of Monday morning, don't you? So you try and cram in more and more pleasure, listening to the deafening sound of Monday arriving. And then you have this feeling that it doesn't quite work, that this instinct to sort of cram pleasure doesn't quite work. And yet we can't live without pleasure. A life without pleasure is unlivable. And, if our work is unsatisfying, if our friendships aren't going very deep, if we're spending most of our time in internet technology, I think we're getting more and more alienated from our direct experience. It's not surprising we look for pleasure in sex and look to it increasingly in sex. One of the great changes since 1960, since I was born in 1961, is this incredible rise of internet technology. And what that's doing, I think, is it's making us more and more alienated from our body, from our emotions. So our body and our emotions can't be pushed aside continually. If you think of it, more and more of us, probably millions of us now, are spending all day looking into a screen, and then when we're tired and can't look into a screen anymore, we watch a DVD. Or we do that thing when you go onto YouTube and go to your favourites. We are living increasingly from one screen to another. And you see how you don't need your body for that. You just need your eyes and actually you don't even need your fingertips, you just need one, don't you? You just need to click on. Eventually you'll just need to wink and it will go on to another thing. So you don't need your body. You're often out of touch with your emotions, aren't you? I don't know whether you've had that experience when you're working on a computer a lot and you get dehydrated, you're bursting to go to the loo, but you can't quite get off it. You just want to go on and do that next click. It's almost like you're going to the loo, you're sort of reaching to the mouse to do your final click, Something incredibly addictive, isn't there, about the internet? I don't know whether you notice, I keep coming to my room, the first thing I want to do is tap my mouse to see whether I've had any emails. So if we're increasingly living on the screen, what it will do, it will distance us from our emotions, and it will distance us from the body. So then we create a gym culture to kind of, compensate for that, and then we watch a screen when we're running on the thing. So it's not surprising, is it, if we are doing that more and more, we absolutely will need pleasure, and we'll need pleasure through the body. And the simplest way is through pornography. I think that's one of the reasons why it's risen so much. You don't have to leave your desk for that. Anyway, perhaps I should leave that aside. There's only so much one needs to say. So what I've started thinking about more and more is this question of pleasure, is this need for pleasure. What are we doing in sex? So the two things I want to talk about, I have finally got to my subject, is arousal. Woo! Can you do that in the Buddhist Centre? I want to talk about arousal. And I want to talk about one of the things that I think is sex is a metaphor for, which is this sort of, it's a metaphor, isn't it? Sort of breaking through the boundaries of yourself. You're trying to dissolve, aren't you, in sex? I say you. We're trying to dissolve in sex. Let's do it now. You're trying to sort of dissolve. You're trying to sort of break through the boundary of yourself. So those are the things I'm sort of thinking about. The whole question of pleasure, the question of arousal, and the question of dissolving, of disappearing. So I think they're things that we really need, and I think that sex is a symbol for those things. Yeah. So as I said, we really need pleasure. A life without pleasure is unlivable. People can't flourish if they don't experience pleasure. And human beings, I think, need quite a lot of pleasure if possible. It's interesting, isn't it? I've got children in my life, and really they mainly want to play. It's really quite difficult to get them to do their homework, or indeed anything else, apart from playing. And they want to play in the way they want to play. It's quite difficult. Like my little niece, I say, okay, now we're going to do a drawing, and she wants to play with her Sylvanian creatures, the little furry things, or arrange them in her bedroom in ever more complex ways. And I think, could we do something more active than that? But no, we're going to do a little. So she wants to play all the time, and getting her to do things like writing. Sometimes it seems almost cruel, to say. But now we're going to, do A is for apple. We're going to spell and write. She clearly really doesn't want to do it. And then a friend of mine has a little boy, and all they clearly want to do is run around and fall over and roll in the mud and shoot each other. To then try and get them to do sums, from an absurdly early age, it seems to me, it seems really almost cruel. So obviously against their nature. Anyway, we want pleasure. We need pleasure. But then, I don't know whether you notice this, but I notice that if I get onto the train of pleasure, I have this, if I'm truthful with myself, I have this sort of uneasy feeling that I'm missing something that doesn't quite touch the spot, really. That cafe moment where you run over to the trendy cafe and you get your cake and a coffee and you've got a newspaper, but you can't actually enjoy all of those things at the same time. You have this funny sense that it doesn't quite do what it's supposed to do. You really wanted to go. Cafe for me is a sort of, I'm afraid it's more cafes than sex now. I think that's an age-related issue. I sort of want something from them, but it doesn't quite give it to me. And it can be as when you give your life to pleasure, I don't know whether you feel this, but I often feel that there's like a station in life, and there's a train of pleasure, and there's a train of meaning. And if you get on one, you seem to have to leave the other. So you get onto the train of pleasure, and you have your, whatever it is, sex, cappuccino, hobnob, whatever you name it, put it under your, that scroll down menu for pleasure. But you have this sense, if you're honest with yourself, that it's not very meaningful. It's not really sort of going anywhere, that there's something missing in it. And then you think, okay, well, I'm going to get off this train of pleasure, I'm going to go and do something meaningful. So I'm going to go to a Buddhist centre, I'm going to go to church, I'm going to take part in this political rally, I'm going to go and be a social worker. When I was young, I decided to go and be a nurse. I wanted to have a meaningful life. I wanted to actually help. I wanted my life to go somewhere. I wanted to make something in my life. But then very often meaning gets divorced from pleasure, doesn't it? I see this in my friends who are involved in left-wing politics. I mean, all you need to do is read an extreme left-wing journal. I mean, they're just full of sort of hatred. And there's very little jokes, I notice. And the level of literature, quite frankly, is appalling. Just sort of argument after, and coming out of a genuine concern for justice, for fighting against the ills of the world, which I feel are the things we should be concerned about. But you then read the literature and you just say, I just don't want this. This is, I can see it's really important. I can see that these things are terrible that are happening in the world. But tell you what, there's a cafe. So you're back to the cafe again. I think that is, for anyone who is attending to their life, I think that is an issue, isn't it? There's this sort of train of pleasure which you can't help but want to get on. You get on it and you think, yeah, but actually other people are having to suffer for my pleasures. I mean, it should be becoming a part of our conscience more and more deeply, that most of the world is suffering for our pleasures. It's really quite disgraceful when you think about it. We're actually living on slave labour, except for we've carefully put them into other countries and in other nationalities that we don't need to feel it so much. So I'm writing my goodly book on Buddhism at the moment, upstairs in my room, but I'm writing on a MacBook which is being made by slaves, and they're working in such awful conditions that the factory that they're working in, they've had to put nets around the walls because so many people keep throwing themselves off the roof because the conditions of working is so dire. But there, meanwhile, I can buy a DVD on it, I can watch YouTube clips, I can live my lovely, luxurious, post-industrial life. But it's on the back of slaves, really. We're like Romans, we're like the Roman Empire. But we don't see them, so we've cleaned it all up. In fact, we're sort of ultra-Romans in that sense. So do you see there's more and more of a sense that actually our pleasures are being bought at other people's pain, and humans can't live like that. We can't really live with that knowledge. So then we go back into politics, we go into, some of my friends going into, fighting for rights and so on. But then so often you then leave pleasure. It's very typical in left-wing politics that they have these huge long meetings and they just go and get slewed afterwards. They have day-long meetings about Russia, it seems, at the moment, and whether it's imperialist. My friend is particularly discussing, is Russia imperialist? I was saying Putin must be on tenterhooks to find out what you're going to decide. He must be on the end of the phone waiting for their deliberations. And then after this day-long meeting, they all go and get slewed. Which I think, again, is indicative of the pressure. We want pleasure, we want meaning. It seems to me that the great matter of life is how to unify meaning and pleasure. Without that unification of meaning and pleasure, our life can't flourish. We'll ricochet between a desire for meaning on one hand, goodly things, whether it's social work, childcare, loving parent, activism, and then pleasure on the other hand, sex, drugs, rock and roll, etc. on the other hand. And we'll tend to ricochet between that. You see it terribly in the Catholic Church, don't you? But you see, that's a symptom of the issue that we've got. We need to find a way urgently need to find a way of unifying pleasure and meaning. If not, we will destroy our world and our life won't flourish. We set up a world in which we can have pleasure whilst other people suffer. And that isn't sustainable. It's inhuman and unsustainable. Eventually, tell you what, they'll want to get what we've got. It will cause more and more instability. But we need to find this unification of pleasure and meaning. So one way of thinking about that is to do with arousal. I'm using this sort of metaphorically, although not too metaphorically. I'm thinking of the sort of the myth of Eros, which then gets translated into erotic and so on. This whole thing of arousal, by which I mean when we're fully into something, when all our energies have suddenly woken up and are into something. That's why sex feels so. One of the reasons why sex feels so important to us. We want something, don't we, that we're just into, that we're not trying to get into, that we don't think is good for us, including something spiritually good for us. We just want to be just fully immersed in something, fully immersed with all of our energies, our physical energies, our emotional energies, all involved in it, without anything left over. We want to be aroused in that sense. You know, the metaphor of arousal is physical. It's not mental. It's a sense of wanting to be into something very strongly. I think this is really what the myth of Eros is about. What in our life touches that yes in us, that galvanizes us, that draws our whole self into play, which is different from being interested in something, or wanting to be interested in something, or being curious about something, intellectually curious about something. It's just like you're in it right now, and you don't want it to stop. In fact, you so much don't want it to stop, you haven't thought of it stopping. Yeah, you're in it. This is the kind of experience I think we need to be looking for, and this is the kind of experience that Buddhism is trying to help us cultivate, where we're aroused in this full sense, physically, emotionally, even intellectually. In a way, the metaphor slightly breaks down with that, but you can be intellectually aroused. You can also be just headbanging, but you can also be intellectually aroused, where suddenly something has grasped your thought in a very deep and powerful way. I remember an experience of this, reading Brian McGee's book on Schopenhauer, the German philosopher. You know, I've never read Schopenhauer himself, but I was interested in philosophy, and I read his book. And I'd always thought that philosophy was just kind of wordplay, you know, sort of silliness, really, for intellectual white people, for silly people, really. But I read this book, and I found myself utterly gripped by him. It felt like Schopenhauer was answering the questions of my life in a way that I thought, I'd never thought of that. Do you know that lovely moment where somebody says, do you see here how this is how you see life, isn't it? But you see how it can't be like that. In McGee's explication of Schopenhauer's philosophy, I really had this sense, this weird kind of almost a vertigo sense that life couldn't be how I assumed it to be. Just couldn't be. He's brilliant at arguing that. You see, you think this and this and this, but what about that? So that can't be that, can it? And that can't be that. And what it does, if you really are into it, you just realise that you do not know, that your understanding about life is trivial, is received, is dogmatic. You actually don't know. And it's this fantastic sense of being aroused. Suddenly life is much more interesting than you thought. So this sense of arousal can come from deep reading. It can come, can't it, in aesthetic experience. For me, that's one of the main ways in which I've experienced it, in aesthetic experience. Trying to think of an example. One of my favourite poets, for instance, is the American or the Canadian poet Elizabeth Bishop. And when I read her poems, I had a deep sense of kinship. It was like we were shaking hands across time. She died in about 1972. I felt that her vision of life I completely understood, as if I was inside her mind, or as if her poems were a description of my mind. Deeply beautiful poems which are not difficult to read. It's taken a long time for people to value them because they seem so straightforward. They go deeper and deeper as you read them. And when I was reading them, particularly when I've read them on retreat, I had this sense of all of my interests and my feelings all being aroused. Yeah. I've had that experience with painting. Some people have that experience in the natural world, where you just feel completely in the natural world. So what we need to be looking for is this sense of arousal. And we might not feel it even very strongly outside of sex, but sex is a metaphor for it. Where do you feel suddenly like you're waking up, where your whole energies are involved? A film can be a strong experience of that. I remember going to see Fanny and Alexander by the Swedish director, what's his name? Fanny and Alexander. Very, very dark film, and I just thought I had this sort of strong sense of yes from it. I went to see Spirited Away. It's the first time I'd seen one of his films. I didn't quite know what the reviews were good. I went along. I felt transported by his imagination, really transported. So much so that I was coming back on the tube home, and I was still in the film. Everything seemed full of magic. All the people on the tube seemed like, that train in the film, incredible train that goes through the water, and it felt like everything was like that. I felt completely aroused by the imagination of the film and involved in it. When you feel like that, you know that's what you want. You know that's what life is for. So often what we feel is the absence of it. One of the things that meditation does, I think, is it confronts you with your direct experience. Often when you close your eyes to meditate, what you notice is the absence of arousal, the absence of this kind of deep interest. Interest is far too trivial a word. I think arousal is better because it's physical. Do you see what I mean? Often what you notice, if you're honest with yourself, is boredom. You just feel a bit bored. You feel how trivial your mind is, how it just goes around the same old rubbish. Our mind's like a YouTube channel, just going one clip to another, and then a favourite clip, another 8 appear every time you click on one. And if you're honest, you get bored by your own YouTube clips. And you really can sometimes feel the lack of this deep engagement with life. You feel its emptiness. Actually, what mostly people do is when they have a slight touch of that, they buy something. So, normally what you do, if you're at your desk starting to feel that funny sense of emptiness, if you're me, you go onto Amazon and buy a poetry book. If you're you might do something else. Which means as soon as you can feel that sense of slight emptiness, that slight boredom, which I think is probably a main current in contemporary life, everything around you is saying buy something, download something, watch something, experience something. You don't need to feel bored. Yeah? So one of the things we could start doing, I think, and I think it's a really radical thing to do in our contemporary age, is do nothing. It's, when you go home today, instead of trying to cram the rest of your day with pleasure, if you've got a garden, just go and sit in the garden with your coat and a cup of tea and just do nothing. Let yourself feel bored, which is the absence of arousal. And instead of going off and having sex or getting a hobnob, hobnob? You see, you have to be very careful. Going off and getting a hobnob, you just feel that boredom, the lack of deep engagement. Actually, as soon as you start to feel that lack, there's a possibility of it arising. You see, because when we do feel that kind of arousal, and it can happen, by the way, in communication, that time in communication where you're chatting and you feel as you're talking to a friend, this is just chat. I'm now 52 and I'm really bored of social situations. I'm becoming sort of sociophobic almost. I just find them really dull. It's so difficult to have any kind of valuable communication. So often it's sort of a mutual showing off, isn't it? I did this, and then you say, I did that. I mean, my nieces say, I'm important, I did that. And we sort of do that in an adult way, don't we? I was on BBC, or I was on Radio 4. You know, it's the sort of same old thing. It's terribly tedious. But again, you can have this sense of sort of, you're actually looking for something much more fully engaging than that. You actually do want to meet other people. You want this arousal to happen. I think that's so easily why we just get into sort of that low-level flirting, because we're just sort of bored with ordinary chit-chat. You want something that grabs you, don't you? Sometimes in communication, it does. I'm very lucky to have really good friends in my life. And Buddhism really emphasizes friendship. And in the best communications with my friends, suddenly I'm fully there, I'm fully interested. I actually really want to, need to, have to talk about this thing that we're talking about now. I remember coming back in a car with Jan of Archer. Actually driving's actually quite a good time, isn't it, to have a good conversation sometimes. And he was trying to talk to me about something that I was frankly resistant about, some thing about spiritual life. I come from the Midlands, so I've got a very sceptical Midlands attitude to things, and I kind of want to naysay things very easily. And he was saying, yes, but what about this? And eventually I remember thinking, okay, what is it you're trying to say? And we just got into this talk about the Buddha, you could say. That's too crude, but about what Buddhism's really about. And Buddhism isn't really about Buddhism, it's about something you can never quite say, something undefinable. But we got into this really genuine communication about the undefinable, that actual grown-up conversation that you thought you'd be having when you were young. That often you're still kind of waiting for. I remember when I was at school thinking, I'm going to have these really grown-up conversations about the nature of reality, and they never seem to happen. Seem to end up talking about Sainsbury's. Anyway, and there we were in that really grown-up conversation. But it wasn't, we weren't just exchanging ideas. There was a sense of arousal, of eros, of being really bothered by this, needing to talk about this. This was really genuinely important, existentially important, emotionally important, physically important to my life. Yeah? So you can experience this kind of eros in communication, this arousal in communication. And what it does, when we feel like that, it takes us over the threshold of ourselves, doesn't it? And I think that's what sex is a metaphor for, is taking us beyond the horizon of ourselves, taking us beyond the threshold of me. We're locked in this kind of me-shaped thing, and after a while it's terribly tedious. Even when it's brilliant and clever and funny, and it's really rather tedious. It's just you. It's just the things you say. Sometimes when people ask you questions, you end up just saying the things you say. That's partly why nowadays I seem to prefer giving talks without notes, because I want to try and find something I want to say, not just the things I can say. When you're aroused in this fully spiritual sense, it takes you beyond the horizon of yourself, beyond the threshold of yourself, into a wholly new life. Like in that communication in the car on the AM11, I was in a new life at that time. Looking at a painting by Titian, I was in a new life. Reading that book about Schopenhauer, I was in a new life. And when you're in it, you really think, this is what my life wants to be about all the time. This is the meaning of my life. That boredom I feel, that kind of ennui, that kind of lassitude, that kind of scrapping around trying to find a bit of pleasure, is to do with the absence of this. That's why one clicks onto a less than salubrious website. That's why one goes and get another hobnob, is because you're not really fully engaged. There's energy waiting to be engaged. And when you are fully engaged, when you are fully aroused in this spiritual sense, it completes you and takes you beyond yourself, which is, I think, what sex is a metaphor for. Something intensely pleasurable, something that arouses your whole energies, that you're just into without wanting to be into, without trying to be into it, and that's something that then takes you beyond the threshold of yourself into a new life that unifies pleasure and meaning, that brings together these two great forces of our lives, without which our lives will bifurcate into an endless quest for pleasure that never quite works, or a noble searching for meaning which kind of dries up and often it ends up with hatred. We need to unify those two things. The only way I think we can do that is to look for these experiences of eros, of arousal, which take us beyond the threshold of ourselves, which take us beyond me. We can find that in meditation, in communication, in the natural world, in life itself. That's what we need to do. Okay, that's me. So we've got a few minutes for any questions. All perfectly straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the experience of love embodied in human sexuality and the opportunity that gives us to touch something divine.
Right. Yeah. In human sexuality.
Yeah.
Well,
what was the question?
I'll reiterate it.
Please, thank you.
It's sort of the question is how do we? Can I say something about finding the divine through sort of sexual love? It's a simple way of it. How long have I got? Well, let's try. My own teacher said that sex is like two paper bags trying to get inside one another. Which is both very witty and very true. In the experience of sex, you're trying to get inside one another, but you can't do it. What you're trying to do finally can't be done. But actually what you're trying to do is that kind of inside in two paper bags inside each other. That is what you might call the divine. So you can find that kind of union, but not on a physical plane. It's a metaphor for something we deeply, innately need. But sex, you can't do it on that level, if you see what I mean. So in Buddhist tradition, there are these sort of mythological world of gods that are supposed to be ranged, a bit like the angelic hierarchy from human beings. So in meditative states, you go from one world to the next. And in these world of gods, as you know, they've told us, I mean, this is a myth, but they've told us, how they have sex. And I think one of them is all they need to do is hold hands. And then the one above that is all they need to do is look at each other. And then I don't think the one above, they're just having sex inside themselves all the time. So you could say that what Buddhist meditation is about is having sex inside yourself. You're trying to ascend, you're trying to take that need for physical sort of drenching pleasure that goes beyond addictive pleasure. You're trying to experience that inside yourself. Meditation is physical, direct, emotional, intimate, in the same way, literally, as sex is. But you're trying to experience that within yourself. And to the degree you've experienced that within yourself, you don't need to get so addicted to it outside yourself. That would be my short answer anyway. Yeah.
Can I ask two questions? How does one reach, or how do I reach, a spiritual state of mind? And as a second question, as a kind of add-on to that, how does one achieve mind sex? Because I think that's
mind
what
sex.
You were alluding to.
Yes, I might not be able to answer both because I might not have. We'll see. I'll answer one at least. Yeah, I'll pick one.
This is fair. One question. One
yeah,
person.
yes.
Is it for
So,
realization? God, sorry, I'm trying to. I asked the question and I'm trying to give you the answer.
Okay, so let's do mind sex sound more interesting. I think when we use a sort of term like that, what we're really getting at is this sense of going beyond ourselves, which feels at the same time a completion of ourselves. You want to feel that complete contentment, that complete sort of blissful contentment. We all, I think, deeply need that. It probably even goes back to being a baby and being lifted and held and all that sort of thing. You want to feel that lovely sense of complete security don't you? I say you. We want to feel that sense of everything's good. I think that it's possible that sort of baby experience, if we've had a healthy one, and unfortunately many of us don't, sort of shines out into adult life, that we deeply want to be picked up again. There's a certain point with my nieces where I won't be able to pick them up. They'll be too heavy, 24. Teenagers can get very big nowadays. Sit down.
I think I like to answer my own.
No, I'll answer it.
Yeah.
No, I'll answer it. Sit down.
I will.
No, I will.
Yeah,
I'm on the top.
Yeah, I know you're on stage.
I'm halfway through though. Let me just finish because I'm halfway through.
Need to be loved.
Yeah.
I'm just paraphrasing what you're saying, really.
So we are trying. I think we really need that, and we can't find that. There isn't any safety for us adults, I think is what I wanted to get to, and perhaps we'll finish with this. It is very touching having little girls in your life and having children in your life. You sort of, as soon as they're upset, you have this instinct, just pick them up, and you say, it's all right, you explain, don't you? You say that, no, the world's safe. No, that was just that. No, that was that. And quite quickly they change, and they're in this world of love. I think we want that very much, but there's no adult version of that. Life isn't safe. In fact, life is as unsafe as it could possibly be, in as much as the one thing you definitely don't want to happen to you will happen to you, and you've no idea when. You couldn't be in a more unsafe situation. There is no return to that experience of safety, which is actually a false experience in a sense. But you see that what the Buddha is, he saw through, what makes him the Buddha is he saw through this delusion of being a self in the first place. We think we really are an existing separate self, and we can't bear our unsafety. As you get older, you realise that how unsafe we are, that no one's going to pick you up anymore, no one's going to make it all right. So you try to protect this self, you worry about getting old and so on. The Buddha represents that he's seen through that self doesn't really exist in the way we think it does. So that on his level, on another level of reality, you are completely safe. Because there isn't anyone here who can die and who is unsafe. It's a slightly, perhaps too deep a point to get into just now, but that's what the aim of Buddhism is, the aim of spiritual life is. To see that our self-sense, which is so innate, which we cherish and try and protect, and which we so fear to lose, is actually a delusion. At our deepest, we can see through that, and when we see through that, we're completely safe. So the Buddha is like someone, and I'll finish with this, the Buddha is like somebody dreaming, and he dreams that he's being chased by a man-eating tiger. He's dreaming this terrible dream, and then he's rushing through the undergrowth and being chased by this terrible man-eating tiger, and there are all his villagers and friends are rushing through the undergrowth with one, and they're all terrified. And then he wakes up. And he realises, oh, what a relief. It was a dream. I was dreaming all that. It's not really like that. And then if you imagine that the Buddha could look back into the dream that he was having, as if it was still going on, he'd see all the villagers and friends still running through the undergrowth. And he'd just want to say, you're dreaming. You're just dreaming. You've misperceived it. It's just a dream. He'd want to, quite naturally, quite spontaneously, just say, wake up. Yeah? And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to wake up from the dream, the frightening dream that we've got into, the nightmare of death. That's really what we're trying to do. So let's leave it at that.